Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Every year, my friends drag me to some New Year's Eve event, and every year I swear it will be the last time. But 2023 felt different. I had just gone through a rough breakup, spent most of December alone in my apartment, and Megan practically showed up at my door to physically pull me out of my isolation. Our little group of 4 had been inseparable since college. Me, Megan, her boyfriend Troy, and my coworker Dennis, who joined our circle after we started working together at a marketing firm downtown. We had all graduated back in 2015, which meant we were hitting that strange phase where half our friends were having babies, and the other half still could not commit to a city. That night, we took a rideshare to the waterfront to watch the fireworks, grabbed some tacos from a food truck, and planned to catch another ride home before surge pricing made the trip cost more than our entire evening out. Everything went smoothly until around 2:30 in the morning, when we were already on our way back. The ride home was through Uber Share, one of those shared ride apps where you split the fare with strangers heading in the same direction. Our driver was a quiet guy named Oscar, who had a small Colombian flag hanging from his rearview mirror, and played soft reggaeton at a volume that felt respectful for the late hour. There were 2 other passengers already in the minivan when we climbed in, a young couple who looked like they had partied way harder than us, the girl already half asleep against the window with glitter smeared across her cheek. The route took us through the northern suburbs, and by the time we hit the residential streets past Oakwood Heights, everything was dead silent. Most people were either still celebrating downtown or passed out at home. The houses looked eerie in the darkness, deflated inflatable snowmen lying flat on frozen lawns, string lights blinking on timers with nobody awake to notice them. Oscar was taking a shortcut through a neighborhood I did not recognize when we stopped at a red light at a 4-way intersection, and that is when everything changed. A dark blue sedan was stopped in the lane next to us, slightly ahead so we could see directly into the driver's side window. At first, I thought the 2 people inside were just having an argument, the kind of loud, messy fight that couples have after drinking too much on a holiday. But then the driver's arm came up, and I saw his fist connect with the woman's face. Not a slap, not a shove, a full closed fist punch that snapped her head against the passenger window. Megan gasped beside me, and Troy leaned forward between the front seats to get a better look. The driver hit her again, this time grabbing a fistful of her hair and slamming her head against the dashboard. The woman was not fighting back. She was not even trying to protect herself. Her arms hung limp at her sides like she had already given up, like this was not the first time. I could see blood on her face now, dark and shiny under the streetlight, smearing across the window where her cheek pressed against the glass. Oscar muttered something in Spanish and looked at us through the rearview mirror, his eyes wide with the same disbelief we all felt. Troy did not hesitate. He reached over and slammed his palm against the horn, holding it down for a solid 5 seconds. The sound cut through the silent neighborhood like a scream, and the man in the sedan stopped mid-swing. His head turned slowly toward our minivan, and I got my first clear look at his face. He was maybe in his 40s, with a thick neck and a shaved head that gleamed under the amber streetlight. His eyes were not wild or crazy like I expected. They were cold, calculated, like he was sizing us up and deciding what to do about the interruption. The light turned green, but nobody moved. For a long, horrible moment, we just stared at each other through the glass. Then his lips curled into something that was not quite a smile, and he raised one finger, pointing directly at our windshield, directly at us, before slowly pulling his car forward and turning right. Dennis already had his phone out, dialing 911 before the sedan even completed the turn. Oscar hit the gas the moment the other car was out of sight, and I felt the minivan lurch forward as we sped through the intersection going straight, putting as much distance as possible between us and whatever we had just witnessed. The young couple in the back row had woken up now, the girl asking in a confused, slurred voice what was happening. Nobody answered her. I was twisted around in my seat, watching the road behind us through the rear window, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. For about 30 seconds I thought we were clear. The street behind us stayed empty, just dark asphalt and parked cars and the occasional porch light. Then a pair of headlights swung around the corner. Fast, way too fast. And I knew immediately it was him. He had circled the block. He had come back for us. Dennis was still on hold with 911, the automated message repeating something about high call volume due to the holiday, and I wanted to scream at the recording that someone was about to die tonight if they did not pick up. Oscar was driving faster now, weaving through the residential streets with a focus that told me this was not his first time in a bad situation. The sedan stayed about 50 feet behind us, matching our speed exactly, never falling back and never getting closer. It was like he wanted us to know he was there, wanted us to feel him right on our tail. Troy was trying to get a photo of the license plate through the back window, but between the darkness and the motion, everything came out blurred. Megan had her arm around me, squeezing tight, and I realized I was shaking, not from cold, but from pure adrenaline flooding every part of my body. The streets were completely empty, every house dark, everyone asleep, or passed out from celebrating. We passed a stop sign without even slowing down, and the sedan did the same. Then another. Oscar made a sharp left turn without signaling, tires squealing against the pavement, and for a moment I thought we had lost him. But when I looked back, those headlights were already rounding the corner behind us, steady and patient, like a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to go. The sedan surged forward without warning, closing the gap between us in seconds. I heard Megan scream as the headlights flooded our back window, so bright I had to shield my eyes. He was right on our bumper now, close enough that I could make out his silhouette through the glare. That thick neck, that bald head, one hand on the wheel and the other doing something I could not see. Oscar swerved hard to the right, and the sedan clipped our back corner with a crunch of metal that sent us fishtailing across the empty street. The young couple in the back was fully awake now, the guy yelling questions that nobody had time to answer. I grabbed the headrest in front of me and held on as Oscar regained control, my teeth rattling from the impact. The sedan had fallen back a few car lengths, but I could see a fresh dent in his front bumper gleaming under a streetlight. And I could see him laughing. Actually laughing, his mouth wide open, shoulders shaking with amusement like this was the most fun he had experienced in years. That image burned itself into my memory. A man who beats women in his car, who chases strangers through empty streets at 3 a.m, laughing like he was watching a comedy show. Finally, a voice came through Dennis's phone. A real human voice, tired and stressed but real. He started talking fast, giving our location as best he could, describing the sedan, the assault we witnessed, the chase that was now entering its 5th minute. The dispatcher told us to stay on the line, to keep moving, that units were being sent, but response times were delayed because of the holiday. Delayed. That word hit me like a punch to the chest. We were being hunted through a sleeping neighborhood, and help was delayed. Oscar shouted that he was heading toward the main road, hoping there would be more traffic, more witnesses, maybe even a police car doing a routine patrol. But the residential street seemed endless. Block after block of identical houses with their porch lights off and their curtains drawn. The sedan rammed us again, harder this time, and I heard something crack underneath the minivan, a sound that made Oscar curse loudly in Spanish. Troy was trying to calm everyone down, telling us we just needed to make it to Bleecker Avenue, where there would be gas stations and a 24-hour diner, but his voice was trembling so badly that the words came out in pieces. We almost made it. I could see the glow of commercial lights ahead, the familiar red and yellow of a gas station sign rising above the rooftops like a beacon. Oscar pushed the minivan as hard as it would go, the engine whining in protest, and for a few beautiful seconds the sedan fell behind. But then came a sound that made my stomach turn, a rhythmic thumping from somewhere beneath us, getting louder with each rotation of the wheels. The first impact had done more damage than we realized. Oscar was losing control, the steering pulling hard to the left no matter how much he fought it. We limped through one more intersection before he had no choice but to pull over. the minivan shuddering to a stop against the curb in front of a dark house with a for sale sign in the yard. The gas station was maybe 3 blocks away. It might as well have been 3 miles. The sedan rolled up behind us and stopped, its headlights illuminating the interior of our vehicle like a stage. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. We sat there in that harsh white light, waiting to see what he would do next. The driver's door of the sedan swung open, and he stepped out onto the street. He was bigger than I expected. Not just the thick neck I had noticed before, but broad shoulders and arms that strained against a dark jacket. He walked toward us slowly, deliberately, his boots making a sound against the asphalt that seemed impossibly loud in the silent neighborhood. Dennis was still on the phone with 911, whispering our new location, begging them to hurry. Oscar reached under his seat and pulled out a tire iron, his jaw set tight, and Troy grabbed the back of his seat like he was ready to jump out and help if it came to that. The man stopped about 10 feet from our rear bumper and just stood there, staring at us through the back window. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and I felt every muscle in my body tense so hard that my vision started to blur at the edges. But he did not pull out a weapon. He pulled out a cigarette and a lighter, lit it casually, and took a long drag while watching us like we were animals in a cage. He wanted us to know that he was in control, that he could take his time, that nobody was coming to save us. The standoff lasted maybe 2 minutes, but it felt like an hour. He finished his cigarette slowly, flicking the butt onto the pavement and grinding it under his boot. Then he started walking toward us again, and this time Oscar threw open his door and stepped out, the tire iron gripped tight in his right hand. I wanted to scream at him to get back inside, but my voice was stuck somewhere deep in my chest. The 2 men faced each other across the empty street, and I could see the calculation happening behind the aggressor's eyes, weighing whether this was worth it, measuring Oscar up, deciding if he could take him. That is when we heard it. Sirens. Faint at first, but getting louder, coming from somewhere to the east. The man heard them too, and something shifted in his posture. He took 1 step back, then another. His eyes swept across our minivan one final time, locking onto each of us through the windows like he was memorizing our faces. Then he pointed at us again, that same slow, deliberate gesture from the intersection, and walked back to his sedan. He got in, reversed smoothly, and disappeared down a side street just as the first red and blue lights appeared in the distance. By the time the patrol car reached us, he was gone. The cops took our statements for almost an hour, parked there on that dark residential street while the sky slowly turned gray with the first hint of dawn. They found the woman from the sedan at a hospital emergency room about 40 minutes later. She had walked in alone, bleeding from a gash above her eyebrow, and refused to say who hurt her. She would not press charges, would not even confirm that she knew the man we described. The police told us this happens more often than people think, that victims protect their abusers for reasons that are complicated and heartbreaking, and that without her cooperation, there was not much they could do. They never caught him. I spent weeks checking news sites, waiting for a story about a bald man with a thick neck arrested for assault or worse, but it never came. Sometimes I still think about that woman, wonder if she got away from him eventually, or if she is still trapped in that car, flinching every time his hand moves. And I think about the way he looked at us through that back window, smoking his cigarette, so patient and calm. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew he would get away with it. The thing that haunts me most is not the chase or the fear. It is the fact that somewhere out there, he is still driving those same streets, and the next person who honks at a red light might not have sirens coming to save them. My buddy Nathan texted me on December 28th, asking if the crew was still doing downtown Portland for New Year's Eve. We had kept this tradition alive since graduating together in 2015, and no matter how crazy life got, that one night stayed sacred. So on December 31st of 2024, 6 of us headed to Pioneer Courthouse Square for the big countdown. Nathan brought his girlfriend Brooke. Our friend Theo came with his brother Julian. And I invited Priscilla from my office, who had just moved to Oregon and never experienced the madness of a proper downtown celebration. The energy was electric from the moment we stepped off the MAX train around 10. Thousands of people packed into the square, breath visible in the cold air, everyone buzzing with that particular excitement that only exists in the final hours of a dying year. We found a decent spot near one of the food vendors, close enough to see the stage where a local band was playing covers of classic rock songs that got swallowed by crowd noise. By 11:30, the crowd had tripled. What started as a comfortable gathering transformed into a crushing mass of bodies pressed together so tight, I could feel strangers breathing against my neck. People kept pushing forward toward the stage, and our little group got separated despite our best efforts to hold on to each other. I lost sight of Nathan first, then Theo and Julian vanished somewhere to my left when a wave of people surged past. Priscilla grabbed my arm and shouted something I could not hear over the noise, but within seconds she got pulled away too, her hand slipping from mine like water through fingers. My phone had died an hour earlier because I forgot to charge it before leaving home, which meant I had no way to text anyone or check our meeting spot. The air grew thick and warm despite the freezing December temperature, a strange mix of body heat and alcohol breath and perfume that made my head swim. I needed to get out just for a minute, just enough space to breathe and think and figure out where everyone went. I pushed sideways through the crowd, using my shoulders to carve a path toward the edge of the square. It took almost 10 minutes to move 50 feet, squeezing between couples holding champagne bottles and groups of college kids wearing glittery hats and blowing noisemakers directly into my ears. When I finally broke free from the densest part of the gathering, I found myself near the corner of Southwest Yam Hill and 6th Avenue, where the crowd thinned enough that I could actually extend my arms without touching another person. A small side alley opened up between two older brick buildings, one of them a closed antique shop with iron bars over the windows. I stepped into the mouth of that alley just to catch my breath, leaning against the cold brick wall and letting the winter air fill my lungs. The noise from the square still thundered behind me, but here it felt muffled, distant, like listening to a concert from outside the venue. I checked my watch and saw 11:47 glowing in the dim light. 13 minutes until midnight, and I had no idea where my friends were. That was when the first firework exploded overhead. Someone had jumped the gun on the countdown, sending a burst of red and gold across the sky that lit up the alley in flickering colors. In that brief flash of light, I saw them. About 40 feet deeper into the alley, two men in dark jackets were dragging a woman toward a service door at the back of one of the buildings. She was struggling, her legs kicking against the pavement, one of her heels scraping the concrete as they pulled her. I saw her mouth open wide, saw her body twist and fight, but the boom of the fireworks swallowed whatever sound she made. For a second, I just stood there, my brain trying to process what my eyes were showing me. Another firework went up, this one green and white, and in its glow I saw her face clearly. Young, maybe mid-20s, mascara streaking down her cheeks, pure terror in her eyes. One of the men had his hand clamped over her mouth while the other gripped her arm so hard I could see the fabric of her silver dress bunching under his fingers. I did not think. I just moved. My feet carried me deeper into the alley before my brain could calculate the danger, and I heard myself yelling something like, "Hey, stop," or "Let her go." I cannot remember the exact words because my heart was pounding so loud it drowned out my own voice. The two men stopped and turned toward me. The fireworks kept exploding above us, painting their faces in bursts of color that made them look almost unreal. The one holding her mouth was shorter, stocky, with a shaved head and a neck thick as a tree trunk. The other was taller and leaner, wearing a black beanie pulled low over his forehead. They did not look panicked or surprised. They looked annoyed, like I was a fly buzzing around their dinner. The tall one said something to his partner in a language I did not recognize, then let go of the woman's arm and started walking toward me. His steps were slow and deliberate, almost casual, and that calmness scared me more than if he had charged. He stopped about 6 feet away from me and tilted his head to one side like he was studying an insect. He spoke in accented English, his voice low enough that I had to strain to hear it over the distant roar of the crowd. and the ongoing firework bursts. "Wrong place, friend. Turn around. Go back to your party." His hand moved to his jacket pocket, and he pulled the zipper down just enough to show me what was inside. The blade caught a flash of blue light from a firework overhead. A folding knife, already open, the edge gleaming. He did not pull it out or wave it around. He just let me see it, let me understand what would happen if I stayed. Behind him, the stocky one still had the woman pinned, his hand tight over her face, and I could see her eyes fixed on me, wide and desperate, begging me not to leave. My mind raced through options like a slot machine spinning too fast to read. I could run back to the square, try to find a cop, but the police barricades had been set up around the main stage area, and I had seen officers redirecting people away from the side streets to manage the crowd flow. By the time I found someone and explained what was happening and led them back here, these men would be gone. The woman would be gone. The tall man took another step toward me, close enough now that I could smell cigarette smoke on his jacket. "Last chance," he said, and something in his tone told me he meant it. Behind us, the crowd in the square started the countdown. 10, 9, 8, their voices rising in unison like a distant wave. I looked past him at the woman, at the tears streaming down her face, at her fingers clawing uselessly at the stocky man's arm. 7, 6, 5. I thought about my dad, who passed away when I was 19, and how he always said that a man is defined by what he does when no one is watching. 4, 3, 2. The tall man smirked and started to turn back toward his partner, assuming I had made my choice. 1. The sky erupted in a symphony of explosions, a cascade of color and thunder that shook the windows of the buildings around us. And in that moment, while the tall man's attention flickered upward for just a fraction of a second, I grabbed a metal trash can lid leaning against the wall and swung it at his head with everything I had. The lid connected with the side of his skull with a sound I will never forget. A hollow, wet thunk that vibrated up through my arms and into my shoulders. He stumbled sideways, crashing into a stack of wooden pallets, and the knife clattered out of his hand onto the pavement. I did not stop to see if he was getting up. I ran past him toward the stocky one, who had released the woman's mouth to reach for something in his own pocket. She screamed then, a raw and broken sound that cut through even the roar of the fireworks, and threw her elbow backward into his ribs. He grunted and loosened his grip just enough for her to twist free. She fell to her knees on the concrete, scrambling toward me on all fours, her silver dress torn at the hem and her hair wild around her face. I grabbed her arm and pulled her up, already turning back toward the mouth of the alley. But the tall man was on his feet again, blood running down the side of his face, and he had retrieved his knife. He stood between us and the way out, his expression no longer annoyed but something much worse. Focused, predatory, like a hunter who had just decided his prey was worth the effort. The woman clutched my arm so hard her nails dug through my jacket sleeve. "There's another way," she gasped, her voice hoarse from screaming. "I saw it when they brought me in. A gate at the back leads to the next street." I did not have time to question her. The stocky man had recovered from the elbow to his ribs and was moving toward us now, flanking his partner, trapping us in a pincer. I turned and ran deeper into the alley, pulling the woman with me, our footsteps echoing off the brick walls. The fireworks were still going, burst after burst, lighting up the narrow passage in strobing flashes of red and gold and green. We passed dumpsters overflowing with cardboard boxes, a rusted bicycle chained to a pipe, puddles of something dark I did not want to identify. The alley twisted left, then right, opening into a small courtyard surrounded by the back entrances of closed businesses. A chain-link gate stood at the far end, maybe 7 feet tall, topped with barbed wire that glinted in the intermittent light. The woman pointed at it, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "There, we can climb it." I heard footsteps behind us getting closer, and the sound of the tall man cursing in that language I could not place. I reached the gate first and grabbed the chain link with both hands, testing its strength. It rattled, but held firm. I turned to the woman and cupped my hands together, creating a step for her foot. "Go, I'll boost you over." She hesitated for just a second, looking at me with an expression I could not read. Gratitude, maybe, or disbelief that a stranger would do this for her. Then she put her foot in my hands, and I lifted her up, my arms screaming from the effort as she grabbed the top of the fence and hauled herself over. She cleared the barbed wire somehow, leaving a strip of silver fabric caught on one of the points, and dropped down to the other side with a grunt of pain. I started climbing after her, my fingers hooking through the diamond-shaped gaps in the chain link, my shoes slipping on the metal. I was halfway up when a hand grabbed my ankle and yanked me backward. I lost my grip and fell, landing hard on my back in the courtyard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. The tall man stood over me, knife in hand, blood still dripping from his temple where I had hit him. His partner was right behind him, blocking any chance of escape back the way we came. The tall man crouched down beside me, pressing the flat of the blade against my cheek. I could feel how cold it was, how sharp the edge, and I thought about how strange it was that this might be the last thing I ever felt. "You should have walked away," he said, almost sadly, like he regretted what he was about to do. The fireworks had slowed down now, the grand finale fading into scattered pops and crackles, and I could hear the distant cheering of the crowd celebrating the new year. I was going to die in this dirty courtyard while thousands of people toasted champagne less than 2 blocks away. The stocky man said something to his partner, gesturing impatiently toward the gate where the woman had escaped. They were arguing, I realized. The stocky one wanted to go after her, finish what they started. The tall one seemed more interested in punishing me for interfering. Their disagreement bought me a few seconds, and I used them to scan the ground around me for anything I could use. My hand found a chunk of broken concrete near the base of the wall, about the size of a baseball, with jagged edges that bit into my palm. I did not have a plan. I just knew I was not going to lie there and let them decide my fate. I swung the concrete chunk upward with everything I had left, catching the tall man in the jaw. I heard teeth crack, heard him howl in pain, and then I was on my feet and running. Not toward the gate, but back into the maze of alleys, hoping to lose them in the darkness. My lungs burned and my back throbbed where I had fallen, but I kept moving, turning corners at random, knocking over trash cans behind me to slow them down. I burst out of an alley onto Southwest Stark Street and nearly collided with a group of drunk partygoers stumbling toward their ride. "Call 911, I shouted at them, not stopping to explain, and then I saw something beautiful. 2 police officers on bicycles, stationed at the corner to manage pedestrian overflow from the main event. I ran toward them, waving my arms, screaming about the woman and the men and the knife. They must have thought I was crazy at first, some drunk guy having a breakdown, but something in my face convinced them to take me seriously. One of them radioed for backup while the other followed me back toward the courtyard, and by the time we got there, the 2 men were gone, vanished into the night like they had never existed at all. The police found the woman 2 blocks away, sitting on the curb outside a late-night diner, shaking and crying but alive. Her name was Valerie, and she told the officers that the men had grabbed her outside a bar on Southwest Alder Street while she was waiting for her Uber. She had been at a party with co-workers, stepped out alone to get her ride, and within seconds they had her. She did not know them, had never seen them before, had no idea why they targeted her. The detective who took my statement said it was likely a random abduction, possibly connected to a trafficking operation they had been investigating for months. They never caught the 2 men. The security cameras in that part of downtown were either broken or pointed in the wrong direction, and the descriptions I gave, stocky bald guy, tall guy with a beanie, matched about 1,000 people in Portland that night. Valerie reached out to me through the detective a few weeks later, wanting to thank me in person. We met at a coffee shop in the Pearl District, and she brought me a gift card and a handwritten note that I still keep in my desk drawer. She told me she had nightmares every night, that she could not walk down the street alone anymore, that she had moved back in with her parents in Beaverton because she could not stand being in her apartment by herself. I did not know what to say. I just told her I was glad she was okay, and I meant it, Nathan and the others had spent 3 hours looking for me that night before I finally tracked them down at the police station where I was giving my statement. Priscilla cried when she saw me. Julian kept saying "dude" over and over like his brain had short-circuited. Brooke made me promise to never do anything that stupid again, and I lied and said I would not. The truth is, I do not know what I would do if I saw something like that again. I hope I would be brave. I hope I would act. But I also know now what it feels like to have a knife pressed against your face, to feel completely certain that you are about to die, and that knowledge changes you in ways you cannot explain. It has been almost a year now. I still go downtown sometimes, still walk past that alley on Southwest Yamhill. The antique shop is a smoothie place now. The courtyard got cleaned up and turned into a small parking lot. There is no sign that anything ever happened there. No memorial, no marker. Just concrete and brick and the ordinary flow of people going about their lives. But every time I pass it, I think about Valerie. I think about those 2 men, still out there somewhere. And I think about what my dad said, that a man is defined by what he does when no one is watching. On New Year's Eve of 2024, in a dark alley while the whole city looked up at the sky, I found out what kind of man I am. I just wish the answer did not still keep me awake at night. Kayla had been begging me to come to her neighborhood party for weeks. My younger sister moved to a cul-de-sac in suburban Phoenix right after her wedding in 2022, and this was her first time hosting anything bigger than a dinner. New Year's Eve seemed like the perfect occasion, she kept saying, and her neighbor Vic had promised to handle the fireworks. I remember rolling my eyes when she mentioned that part during our phone call. Fireworks in a residential area always made me nervous, but she assured me Vic knew what he was doing. He had connections, she said, worked for some company that did pyrotechnics for events. At 34, I should have trusted my gut more than my little sister's enthusiasm. But she sounded so excited, and I had spent the last 3 New Year's celebrations alone in my apartment with cheap champagne and whatever was streaming. So I drove the 2 hours from Tucson, arriving just as the sun was setting behind the stucco houses and dyeing the whole street this gorgeous shade of burnt orange. The backyard was smaller than I expected, maybe 40 feet deep before it hit a wooden fence that separated my sister's property from the house behind her. Vic had set up his equipment near that fence, which struck me as odd even before I understood what I was looking at. There were these metal racks, almost like ladder frames holding thick cardboard tubes pointed at the sky. A folding table next to them was covered with boxes I could not read from across the yard. Around 30 people milled around on the patchy grass, holding plastic cups and paper plates loaded with appetizers. Tiki torches lined the perimeter, their flames dancing in the slight breeze. My sister ran over the moment she spotted me, wrapping me in a hug that smelled like her vanilla perfume, and the sangria she was clearly already enjoying. She introduced me to a blur of faces I immediately forgot. Neighbors and co-workers and friends of friends, everyone in that buzzing pre-midnight mood where strangers become temporary best friends. I grabbed a drink and tried to relax, but my eyes kept drifting back to those tubes near the fence, counting them. There had to be at least 20. Around 11, Vic started gathering everyone closer to watch him prep the show. He was a stocky guy in his 50s with a gray goatee and a baseball cap that said something about veteran pyrotechnicians. His hands moved with confidence as he checked connections and adjusted angles, and I noticed he was wearing thick leather gloves. That detail should have reassured me, but it did the opposite. If he needed protection, what about the rest of us standing 15 feet away with nothing but flip cups in our hands? I mentioned this to a woman next to me, a redhead named Donna, who lived 3 houses down. She laughed and said Vic did this every year, that he was a total pro. Her 8-year-old son was sitting cross-legged on the grass near the front of the crowd, his face lit up with anticipation. I wanted to suggest she pull him back a bit, but I did not want to be that person, the paranoid guest ruining everyone's fun. So I stayed quiet, sipping my drink, watching Vic move between the racks like a surgeon preparing his instruments. The countdown started at 5 minutes to midnight. Someone had connected a phone to a portable speaker, and we could hear the broadcast from Times Square mixing with the neighborhood noise, other parties on adjacent streets, distant pops and crackles from early fireworks, dogs barking in protest. Kayla found me in the crowd and grabbed my arm, her eyes glassy from the sangria, but her smile so genuine it made me feel guilty for being anxious. She said this was going to be amazing, that Vic had spent over $2,000 on this display. I remember thinking that was insane, that amount of money on something that would last maybe 10 minutes, but then everyone started counting down from 30, and I got swept up in it despite myself. The voices around me grew louder, 20, 15, 10. Vic stood by his setup with a long lighter in his hand, waiting. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The cheering erupted, people hugged and kissed, and Vic touched the flame to the first fuse. The first few shots were beautiful. I will give him that. Golden bursts that spread across the sky like dandelion seeds caught in a wind, followed by crackling red ones that sounded like 1,000 tiny whips snapping at once. Everyone tilted their heads back, mouths open, the colors reflecting in their eyes. I felt myself relaxing a little, thinking maybe I had been ridiculous to worry. Vic moved along the rack with practiced ease, lighting fuses in sequence, stepping back to admire his work before moving to the next. The show was synchronized in a way that felt almost musical, the explosions building on each other in rhythm. I pulled out my phone to record a clip for my social media, something I rarely did, but the display was genuinely impressive. Then came a deeper boom, one of those big mortars that shake your chest from the inside. A purple flower bloomed overhead, and everyone gasped and applauded. Vic raised his fist in triumph. That was when I noticed the rack on the far left had started to tilt. It happened so fast that my brain almost refused to process it. The metal frame leaned maybe 5 degrees, then 10, and before anyone could react, one of the tubes fired. Not up, but sideways, almost parallel to the ground. The mortar shot across the yard like a flaming comet, trailing sparks and smoke, and slammed into the wooden fence about 3 feet to my right. The explosion was nothing like the ones in the sky. This was concentrated, violent, a punch of light and heat that sprayed splinters in every direction. Someone screamed, a sound that cut through the ringing in my ears. I stumbled backward and collided with a man I did not know, both of us nearly falling onto a knocked-over lawn chair. When I looked up, the rack had tilted further, and I could see the next tube in line, its fuse already burning down. It was pointing directly at the crowd. I do not remember making the decision to scream. The sound just ripped out of me, raw and primal. A single word repeated over and over. Move, move, move. People were already stumbling in different directions, but most of them had no idea what was happening. The sky was still exploding with color from the other racks that had not fallen, and the noise was so overwhelming that my warning barely carried. I grabbed the arm of the person closest to me, an older man with a white beard who looked completely disoriented, and yanked him toward the sliding glass door that led into the house. The second mortar fired just as we moved. I heard it more than saw it, a whooshing hiss followed by an impact somewhere behind us. Glass shattered, one of the tiki torches maybe, or a window. The old man tripped on a cooler and went down hard, pulling me with him. My knees hit the concrete patio, and the pain was sharp and immediate. But I forced him up because I could hear another fuse crackling in that terrible countdown rhythm. The backyard had descended into absolute chaos. Folding chairs were everywhere, knocked over by people trying to flee in every direction at once. I saw Donna sprinting toward the side gate with her son in her arms, his face buried against her shoulder. Someone was crying, a high-pitched keening sound that mixed with the ongoing explosions overhead. Vic was shouting something I could not understand, waving his arms near the fallen rack like he could somehow will it back into position. Another mortar launched from the tilted frame, and this one went low and fast, skipping off the grass before detonating against the back wall of the house. Stucco crumbled and rained down in chunks. A window on the second floor shattered outward, spraying glass onto the crowd below. I felt something sting my forearm and looked down to see blood, a thin line where a shard had sliced through my skin. The pain was distant, unreal. All I could think about was finding Kayla. I spotted her near the back door, crouched behind an overturned patio table with two other women. Her eyes found mine across the yard, and even in the strobing light of the fireworks still launching from the upright racks, I could see how terrified she was. Her mouth was forming my name, but no sound reached me through the cacophony. I started moving toward her, staying low, weaving between abandoned chairs and spilled drinks. The grass was slick with something, beer maybe, or the sangria from a shattered pitcher. My foot caught on a power cord and I nearly went down again, catching myself on the edge of a plastic table at the last second. Another mortar fired from the fallen rack, and I watched it arc sideways into the neighbor's yard. The explosion lit up the fence line, and I heard a woman over there start screaming in Spanish. The whole neighborhood was awake now, porch lights flicking on up and down the street, but nobody could help us. The remaining tubes were still loaded, still connected to whatever chain of fuses Vic had rigged, and they were going to keep firing until every last one was spent. I reached Kayla and pulled her into a crouch beside me, both of us pressed against the side of the house where a small overhang offered some protection. Her whole body was trembling, and when she grabbed my hand, her fingers were ice cold despite the warm Arizona night. She kept saying she was sorry over and over, like this was somehow her fault for inviting me. I told her to stop, that we needed to focus, that we needed to get inside the house. The sliding glass door was maybe 15 feet away, but crossing that open space felt like crossing a minefield. I counted the tubes I could still see on the fallen rack. 4, maybe 5. It was hard to tell in the chaos. Each one was a bomb waiting to go off in a random direction. Vic had finally backed away from the equipment, his face pale and slack, all that earlier confidence completely gone. He was just standing there, frozen, while people ran past him toward any exit they could find. I wanted to scream at him, to ask him what kind of professional lets something like this happen, but there was no time. The next fuse was already sparking. I grabbed Kayla by the wrist and we ran. Not toward the sliding door anymore. There were too many people crowding that entrance, pushing and shoving in blind panic. Instead, I pulled her along the side of the house, toward the narrow gate that led to the front yard. The space between the house and the fence was barely wide enough for us to move single file, and I could feel the heat from the explosions radiating off the stucco wall beside me. Another mortar fired behind us and the sound was deafening, a crack followed by a roar that seemed to vibrate through my entire skeleton. Something whizzed past overhead, trailing orange sparks. We burst through the gate and stumbled onto the front lawn just as the last few tubes emptied themselves into the night. From this angle, I could see the damage clearly. The scorched fence, the blackened patch of grass, the smoke pouring from a hole in the side of the house where one of the mortars had punched through. Fire was licking at the edges of that hole, small but growing. Someone was already on the phone with 911. Sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer. The aftermath felt like waking up from a nightmare only to find out everything was real. Paramedics treated 7 people for burns, cuts, and smoke inhalation. Donna's son had a piece of wood embedded in his calf that required surgery. He still walks with a slight limp today. The old man I had dragged to safety suffered a mild heart attack from the stress and spent 3 days in the hospital. Vic faced criminal charges for reckless endangerment and operating unlicensed fireworks in a residential area. Turned out his connections were just a guy he knew who smuggled professional-grade mortars from Mexico, and he had no real training at all. Kayla's house needed over $40,000 in repairs. She sold it 6 months later and moved to a different state. Said she could not stand being in that backyard anymore. I still have a faint scar on my forearm where the glass sliced me, a thin white line that catches the light when I move a certain way. Every New Year's Eve since then, I stay inside with all the curtains drawn. When midnight comes and the fireworks start outside, I put on noise-canceling headphones and turn the television up as loud as it will go. Some sounds you just never want to hear again. January 1st, 2024, started with my pager going off at 6 in the morning. Volunteer firefighting in rural Hendricks County, Indiana had been part of my life for about 3 years at that point, long enough to have seen my share of car wrecks, kitchen fires, and the occasional barn collapse. My wife Shelley groaned next to me in bed, still half asleep from the New Year's Eve party we had hosted the night before. I kissed her forehead, threw on my gear, and drove my pickup through the frozen darkness toward State Road 39. The dispatcher said it was a single-vehicle accident. SUV versus a drainage ditch. Possible entrapment. Standard stuff for icy roads and hungover drivers who thought they could make it home after celebrating too hard. Having just turned 34 the previous month, I figured I had seen enough of these calls to know exactly what to expect. I remember thinking I would be back in time for breakfast with the kids. When I arrived at the scene, the sun was just starting to bleed pink and orange across the flat Indiana farmland. The SUV, a dark green Ford Explorer, maybe 2018 model, had gone off the road and flipped into the frozen ditch at an ugly angle. Chief Randy Bowman was already there with his truck, along with 2 other volunteers, Cliff Sanger and a newer guy named Pete, who had joined us maybe 6 months prior. The driver was out of the vehicle, sitting on the frozen ground about 15 feet away from the wreck, and I could see blood running down the side of his face even from a distance. He was a white male, maybe mid-40s, wearing a heavy coat and jeans, and he was rocking back and forth slowly like a man in shock. I grabbed my medical bag and started walking toward him, but something about the way Chief Bowman was standing near the SUV made me pause. He had this look on his face, not panic, but something close to confusion mixed with concern, and he waved me over before I could reach the injured driver. "Garrett, come take a look at this," Randy said in a low voice as I approached. He was shining his flashlight into the back of the overturned Explorer, illuminating the cargo area through the shattered rear window. The vehicle was resting on its roof, so everything inside had collapsed downward in a mess of broken glass, loose items, and what looked like camping gear. But there was something else in there too. Something large, wrapped in a blue tarp and secured with bungee cords. The shape was unmistakable even before my brain fully processed what I was seeing. It was roughly 6 feet long, narrower at one end than the other, and the tarp had partially come loose during the crash, revealing what looked like a bare human foot sticking out from beneath the plastic. Pale, waxy, with toenails that had been painted a dark shade of red. I took a step back without meaning to, my boots crunching against the frozen gravel. Randy grabbed my arm and pulled me aside, away from the vehicle, his breath coming out in thick white clouds. "I already called dispatch," he whispered. "Sheriff's on the way, but that's going to be at least 30 minutes, maybe more with these roads." I looked back at the driver, who was still sitting on the ground in that slow rocking motion, blood dripping from a gash somewhere above his hairline. Pete had approached him now and was trying to get him to respond to questions, but the man seemed completely unaware of his surroundings. His eyes were open but vacant, staring at nothing in particular, and his lips were moving slightly like he was talking to himself. Cliff jogged over to where Randy and I were standing, his face flushed from the cold. "What's the situation with the vehicle? We need to check for other passengers or—" Randy cut him off with a sharp shake of his head. "Nobody touches that SUV until the sheriff gets here. We got a situation." He didn't elaborate, but something in his tone made Cliff go quiet immediately. The 4 of us stood there in the growing morning light, the frozen cornfields stretching out in every direction, and I became acutely aware of how isolated we were. The nearest farmhouse was probably half a mile away, and there wasn't another vehicle in sight on the long, straight ribbon of State Road 39. Just us, the overturned Explorer, the bleeding man, and whatever was wrapped in that blue tarp. I told Randy I should at least try to treat the driver's head wound before he bled out or went into shock, and he agreed with a reluctant nod. As a volunteer firefighter with EMT basic certification, stabilizing injured people was part of the job, even when those people might be involved in something criminal. I grabbed my kit and walked over to where Pete was crouching beside the man, trying unsuccessfully to get him to make eye contact. Up close, I could see the driver more clearly now. He was probably 45 or 50, with a thick build and rough hands that suggested manual labor. Construction, maybe, or farm work. His face was weathered and lined, his hair cut short and streaked with gray, and there was a small scar running through his left eyebrow that looked old, maybe decades old. The gash on his head was about 2 inches long, bleeding steadily but not catastrophically, located just above his right temple. I introduced myself, told him I was there to help, and asked if he could tell me his name. He didn't respond. His lips kept moving in that silent mutter, and when I leaned closer to try to hear what he was saying, I caught fragments of words that didn't quite connect, something about not supposed to be here, and she made me promise. I cleaned the wound as best I could and applied a pressure bandage while Pete held a flashlight steady. The man didn't flinch, didn't react at all to my touch, which was concerning on its own. Head injuries can do strange things to people, and I had seen accident victims act completely detached from reality before, their brains struggling to process trauma. But there was something different about this guy, something in the way he held his body, rigid, almost defensive, like he was bracing for an attack that hadn't come yet. When I finished with the bandage, I tried again. "Sir, can you tell me what happened? Were you driving alone?" For the first time, his eyes focused, locking onto my face with an intensity that made me want to lean back. His pupils were uneven, which suggested a concussion, but there was awareness behind them now. Real, frightened awareness. "You can't look in there," he said, his voice hoarse and cracked. "Please, you have to understand. You can't look in there." I kept my voice calm, professional, the way we were trained. "Sir, we've already seen what's in the vehicle. The sheriff is on his way. Right now, I need to make sure you're okay." His face crumpled, and for a moment I thought he was going to cry. Instead, he grabbed my wrist with a grip that was surprisingly strong and pulled me closer, his breath sour and metallic from the blood he had swallowed. "She was already dead," he whispered. "I swear to God she was already dead when I found her." I pulled my wrist free and stood up, my heart beating faster than I wanted to admit. Randy had walked over during the exchange and heard the last part, his expression hardening into something unreadable. "Found her where?" he asked, his voice flat and controlled. The driver looked up at him, then back at me, then at Pete like he was calculating something in his damaged head. For a long moment, I thought he was going to shut down again, retreat back into that vacant stare. But instead he started talking, slowly at first, then faster, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. He said his name was Vernon Hatch, that he lived about 40 miles north in a town called Frankfurt, that he worked as a groundskeeper at a private cemetery outside of Lafayette. He said he had been driving home from a New Year's Eve gathering at his brother's house when he saw the body on the side of the road, just lying there in the frozen grass near a bridge overpass. A woman, young, maybe late 20s, wearing nothing but a thin dress despite the freezing temperature. He said he stopped to check on her and realized immediately that she was dead. No pulse, no breath, her skin already cold and stiff. He panicked. He didn't know why, couldn't explain it even to himself, but something in his brain told him that if he called the police, they would blame him. So he wrapped her in a tarp he had in his truck, loaded her into the back of his SUV, and started driving with no clear destination in mind. That was when he hit the ice patch and lost control. None of us said anything for a long moment after he finished. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the frozen landscape, and I could hear the distant sound of a truck engine somewhere down the road. Vernon Hatch sat there on the frozen ground, his bandaged head drooping, his hands trembling in his lap. His story was insane, the kind of thing that sounded like a lie specifically because no rational person would ever do what he claimed to have done. But there was something in his voice, in the way his eyes kept darting toward the overturned Explorer, that made me wonder. I had dealt with liars before, people who caused accidents and tried to blame road conditions or other drivers or mechanical failures. They usually had a smoothness to them, a practiced quality to their excuses. Vernon didn't have that. He sounded like a man who had made a catastrophic decision in a moment of panic and was only now realizing the full weight of what he had done. Randy crouched down in front of him, his knees popping in the cold air. "You're telling me you found a dead woman on the side of the road, and instead of calling 911, you decided to put her in your vehicle and drive away?" Vernon nodded miserably. "I know how it sounds, I know. But I'm telling you the truth. I didn't hurt her. I didn't even know her. She was just lying there, and I didn't know what to do." The sound of the approaching engine grew louder, and I turned to see a Hendricks County Sheriff's cruiser coming down State Road 39, its lights flashing but no siren. Behind it, maybe a quarter-mile back, I could see what looked like an ambulance. Relief washed through me. This was no longer our problem to figure out. Whatever Vernon Hatch had done or hadn't done, it was about to become a matter for people with badges and investigative authority. Deputy Connie Russo stepped out of the cruiser, a tall woman in her early 50s with short gray hair and a face that looked like it had seen every kind of human ugliness over a long career. She took in the scene with quick, practiced eyes. The overturned SUV, the injured man on the ground, the four of us standing around in our firefighter gear looking like we had just witnessed something we couldn't quite process. Randy walked over to meet her, and I watched them have a brief, intense conversation, their breath fogging in the cold air. Deputy Russo's expression didn't change, but I saw her hand move to rest on her holster as she glanced toward Vernon. She said something into her radio, then walked over to where he was sitting and crouched down in front of him, her posture calm but alert. I couldn't hear what she said to him, but I saw Vernon start talking again, his hands gesturing weakly as he repeated his story. The paramedics arrived and started working on Vernon while Deputy Russo walked over to the SUV with Randy and shined her flashlight into the cargo area. I stayed back with Pete and Cliff, the three of us watching in silence as she examined the blue tarp and its contents. After a few minutes, she stood up and made another radio call, her voice too low for me to hear the words, but her tone unmistakably serious. More units were coming. I could tell that much from the way she kept looking down the road, waiting. Pete lit a cigarette with shaking hands and offered me one, but I shook my head. "You think he's telling the truth?" he asked quietly. "About finding her like that?" I didn't have an answer. The whole situation felt surreal, like something from a crime documentary rather than a Tuesday morning in rural Indiana. I kept thinking about that foot sticking out from under the tarp, the dark red nail polish, the waxy pallor of the skin. Somebody's daughter, somebody's sister, maybe somebody's mother. Whoever she was, she had been alive not too long ago. And now she was a body in the back of a wrecked SUV, and the only person who might know what happened to her was a man who claimed he had just been trying to do the right thing in the worst possible way. Over the next hour, the scene transformed into something out of a procedural drama. 2 more sheriff's vehicles arrived, followed by a state police cruiser and a white van from the county coroner's office. Yellow crime scene tape went up around the SUV, and a perimeter was established that pushed us volunteer firefighters to the edge of the action. Vernon Hatch was loaded into the ambulance, still talking to anyone who would listen, his bandaged head turning frantically as Deputy Russo rode along with him. I overheard one of the state troopers mention that they were sending units to check the bridge overpass Vernon had described, about 20 miles north on a county road near the Tippecanoe County line. Randy pulled us together near his truck and told us we were free to go, that our job here was done, but none of us moved right away. There was an unspoken understanding that we had stumbled into something bigger than a simple traffic accident, and walking away felt incomplete somehow. Cliff finally broke the silence by saying he needed to get home to his kids, and Pete muttered something about needing coffee, and slowly we drifted back to our vehicles. I sat in my pickup for a long moment before starting the engine, watching the coroner's team carefully extract the blue tarp from the overturned Explorer. The shape inside was unmistakably human, and even from 50 yards away I could see the stiffness of the limbs, the unnatural angles that only death can create. I drove home in a daze, my mind running through everything I had seen and heard. Shelley was awake when I walked in, making pancakes for our 2 boys, and she took one look at my face and asked what was wrong. I told her it had been a rough call but didn't go into details. Some things you don't bring to the breakfast table, especially not with a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old asking why Daddy looks so tired. I ate mechanically, showered, and tried to sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that foot sticking out from under the tarp, the dark red polish on the toenails. I kept thinking about Vernon Hatch and his impossible story, the fear in his eyes when he grabbed my wrist, the desperation in his voice when he swore he hadn't hurt her. Part of me wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that he really was just a panicked idiot who made a catastrophic decision on a freezing highway in the middle of the night. But another part of me, the part that had seen the way he avoided looking at the SUV, the way his hands trembled even before I touched his wound, couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than he was telling. The news broke 2 days later. I was at the fire station doing equipment maintenance when Randy called me into his office and showed me the article on his computer screen. The woman in the tarp had been identified as Marissa Keene, 31 years old, a dental hygienist from West Lafayette, who had been reported missing by her roommate on New Year's Eve. According to the preliminary coroner's report, she had died from blunt force trauma to the head, and the estimated time of death was somewhere between 10 in the evening and 2 in the morning on December 31st, hours before Vernon Hatch claimed to have found her body on the side of the road. The article went on to say that Hatch had been arrested and charged with murder, that investigators had found evidence linking him to the victim, and that he was being held without bail pending further investigation. I read the words twice, 3 times, trying to reconcile them with the man I had treated on that frozen highway. The scared, confused, desperate man who had grabbed my wrist and sworn he was innocent. Randy closed the browser and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes with the heels of his hands. "Hell of a way to start the new year," he said quietly. I nodded but didn't respond. There was nothing to say that would make any of it make sense. The details came out slowly over the following weeks, pieced together from news reports and courtroom documents and the occasional conversation with Deputy Russo, who I ran into at a gas station one evening in late January. Vernon Hatch, it turned out, had known Marissa Keene. They had met at a grief support group in Lafayette about 8 months earlier. Vernon had lost his wife to cancer in 2022, and Marissa had lost her younger brother in a motorcycle accident. According to witnesses from the group, they had formed a friendship that Vernon apparently misinterpreted as something more. When Marissa gently rejected his advances, he became obsessive, showing up at her workplace, sending dozens of text messages, leaving notes on her car. She had filed for a restraining order just 2 weeks before her death, but it hadn't been processed yet. On New Year's Eve, investigators believed, Vernon followed her from a party she had attended with friends, forced her off the road near that bridge overpass, and killed her in a rage. The tarp, the bungee cords, the whole elaborate story about finding her body. It was all a desperate attempt to create an alibi that fell apart the moment he lost control of his SUV on the ice. Vernon Hatch was convicted of first-degree murder in September of that year and sentenced to life without parole. I didn't attend the trial, but I followed it in the news, reading every article I could find like I was searching for something that would help me understand. The thing that haunts me even now isn't the image of that foot sticking out from under the tarp, or the way Marissa Keene's family wept in the courtroom when the verdict was read. It's the way Vernon looked at me on that frozen highway, the way he grabbed my wrist and begged me to believe him. In that moment, I did believe him. I looked into his eyes and saw what I thought was genuine terror, genuine confusion, and I felt sorry for him. I've been a volunteer firefighter long enough to think I can read people, to trust my instincts about who's telling the truth and who's lying. But Vernon Hatch fooled me completely. He sat there with blood running down his face and told me a story so absurd that it almost sounded true. And I bought it. I think about that sometimes when I respond to calls now, when I'm treating someone at an accident scene or a house fire and they're telling me what happened. I think about how easy it is to believe someone who seems scared, who seems vulnerable, who seems like a victim. And I remember that the real victim that morning was wrapped in a blue tarp in the back of an overturned SUV, silent and cold, while her killer sat 15 feet away convincing me he was innocent. That's what stays with me. That's what I can't forget. The knowledge that I looked evil in the face and felt nothing but sympathy. Celebrating my birthday on December 31st always felt like a blessing and a curse. On one hand, the whole world throws a party. On the other, good luck getting anyone to focus on you when fireworks and champagne are involved. By 2024, after graduating college in 2017 and spending years building a career in marketing, I figured I deserved one night of real celebration. My friend Heather had been raving about this upscale nightclub downtown called Velour for months. One of those places where the cocktails cost $20 and the bouncers wear earpieces like Secret Service agents. She convinced me that ringing in the new year there would be the perfect way to mark another trip around the sun. I spent $200 on a sequined dress and another $50 on heels I could barely walk in. Heather picked me up around 10, and we arrived just as the line was wrapping around the block. The bass from inside vibrated through the concrete, and I remember thinking this was exactly what I needed. The interior of Velour matched every expectation I had built in my head. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting prismatic light across a dance floor packed with bodies moving in synchronized chaos. VIP sections were roped off with velvet, occupied by people who looked like they belonged in magazine spreads. Heather grabbed my wrist and pulled me toward the main bar, where 3 bartenders in matching black vests were shaking cocktails like performers. I ordered a single vodka cranberry, my only drink of the night, wanting to stay sharp enough to actually remember the countdown. Heather disappeared into the crowd around 11, chasing after some guy she recognized from her spin class, and I found a spot near one of the tall tables overlooking the dance floor. The music was loud, the energy electric, and I felt genuinely happy for the first time in months. I checked my phone, saw it was 11:42, and started scanning the room for Heather so we could find a good spot for midnight. That was when a man in a server uniform approached my table carrying a tray with a single champagne flute. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with a shaved head and a jawline sharp enough to cut glass. His uniform matched the other staff members perfectly: black vest, white dress shirt, even the little gold pin on his collar that said Velour in cursive script. He smiled and placed the glass in front of me, leaning in close to be heard over the music. "Complimentary champagne for the countdown," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the bar. I thanked him without a second thought. This was exactly the kind of thing upscale clubs did, especially on New Year's Eve. He nodded once and disappeared into the crowd before I could even ask if he had seen a redhead in a green dress, which was Heather. The champagne looked expensive, with tiny bubbles rising in perfect columns, and I brought it to my lips without hesitation. The first sip tasted slightly bitter, which I attributed to whatever high-end brand they were pouring. I took another small sip and set the glass down, turning my attention back to the dance floor. 11:47. The DJ was building toward something, layering beats that made the whole room pulse like a single living organism. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me, subtle at first, like standing up too fast. I gripped the edge of the table and blinked hard, trying to focus. The light seemed brighter, the music louder, and the faces around me started to blur at the edges. My legs felt heavy, as if someone had filled my shoes with wet sand. I had experienced tipsy before, and this was not that. 1 vodka cranberry and 2 sips of champagne should not have done this to me. My vision started narrowing, the periphery going dark like someone was slowly closing curtains on either side of my eyes. I fumbled for my phone, but my fingers felt thick and clumsy, disconnected from my brain. I needed to move. I needed to find Heather, find a security guard, find anyone who could help me. I pushed myself away from the table and immediately stumbled, catching myself on the arm of a stranger who barely glanced at me, before turning back to his conversation. The room was spinning now, not dramatically like in movies, but in slow tilts that made every step feel like walking on a ship in rough waters. I aimed for the restrooms, remembering they were near the back hallway, past the second bar. People bumped into me constantly, too absorbed in their own celebrations to notice a woman struggling to stay upright. The countdown clock on the main screen showed 11:51, 9 minutes until the new year. 9 minutes until everyone would be screaming and kissing and completely oblivious to anything else happening around them. I made it maybe 20 feet before two men appeared on either side of me, one grabbing my elbow and the other placing a hand on my lower back. "Hey, there she is," the one on my left said loudly, his voice carrying a practiced cheerfulness that made my stomach turn. "We have been looking everywhere for you." He was shorter than the man who gave me the champagne, stocky with a thick neck and a goatee that looked like it had been drawn on with a marker. The other one was younger, maybe mid-20s, with sandy hair and a polo shirt that screamed fraternity alumni. They moved in perfect coordination, guiding me toward the back of the club like they had done this 100 times before. I tried to pull away, but my arm felt like it belonged to someone else. "She always does this," the younger one said to a couple who glanced our way, shaking his head with an exasperated smile. "Too much champagne, you know how it is." The couple laughed and returned to their drinks. Nobody questioned it. Nobody asked if I was okay. It was New Year's Eve, and everyone assumed I was just another drunk girl being helped home by her friends. Somewhere deep in the fog, clouding my brain, a survival instinct kicked in. I remembered reading somewhere that you should make a scene, be loud, be difficult, because predators rely on compliance. I planted my heels into the floor as hard as I could, which was not very hard given my condition, and let out a sound that was meant to be a scream, but came out more like a strangled moan. The stocky one tightened his grip on my elbow, his fingers digging in hard enough to leave bruises I would find the next morning. "Easy now," he muttered close to my ear, his breath hot and smelling like whiskey. "You are making a scene." I saw the restroom sign glowing maybe 15 feet ahead and made a decision. I went completely limp, letting my body drop like dead weight. The move caught them off guard, and for a split second their grip loosened. I threw myself sideways, crashing into a group of women in matching silver dresses who shrieked and spilled their drinks everywhere. The chaos gave me just enough cover to crawl on my hands and knees, toward the bathroom door. I do not remember pushing the door open. I do not remember locking myself in the handicap stall at the far end. What I remember is pressing my back against the cold tile wall and fumbling with my phone, my vision swimming so badly that the screen looked like it was underwater. I managed to pull up the number for the club, which I had saved earlier in case Heather and I got separated. A woman answered on the third ring, barely audible over the music bleeding through the line. "I need security," I said, or at least I tried to say. The words came out slurred and broken. "Someone drugged me. 2 men, trying to take me out." There was a pause, then her voice sharpened. "Where are you right now?" "Bathroom," I managed. "Back hallway." "Stay there," she said. "Do not move. Do not open the door for anyone except security. They will knock 3 times and say the word midnight." I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the floor, my sequined dress bunched up around my thighs, and I waited. The bathroom door opened twice while I sat there. The first time, I heard heels clicking on tile and 2 women laughing about someone named Brad who had apparently kissed the wrong girl at the bar. They fixed their makeup, complained about the line, and left without ever knowing I was 10 feet away fighting to stay conscious. The second time was worse. The door creaked open slowly, and there were no voices, no heels, just the soft thud of flat shoes on tile. I held my breath, which was difficult because my lungs felt like they were wrapped in plastic. The footsteps moved methodically, stopping at each stall. I watched the shadow pass under the gap at the bottom of my door, a dark shape that paused for just a moment too long. Then a knock. Not 3 knocks. Just one, slow and deliberate. I pressed my hand over my mouth to keep from making any sound. The shadow lingered, and I could hear breathing on the other side of the door, patient and unhurried. Then the main bathroom door burst open and a woman's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Security, we are clearing the restroom." The shadow retreated instantly, footsteps quick and light, disappearing out the door before the security team could fully enter. I heard a woman's voice call out, asking if anyone needed assistance, and I finally let myself speak. "In here," I croaked. "Back stall." The lock clicked open from the outside, and I found myself staring up at a woman in a black polo with security printed across the chest in white letters. She was built like someone who had played college softball, broad shoulders and arms that looked like they could throw a punch without thinking twice. Behind her stood a man with a shaved head and a radio crackling on his hip. The woman crouched down to my level, her eyes scanning my face with a clinical efficiency that made me feel both safe and terrified. "Can you tell me what happened?" I told her everything I could remember, my words still thick and clumsy. The champagne, the man in the server uniform, the two men who tried to take me outside. She exchanged a look with her partner that told me this was not the first time they had heard a story like mine. They brought me to a back office, a small room cluttered with monitors showing feeds from cameras positioned throughout the club. The countdown had already happened while I was on the bathroom floor, and confetti still drifted through the main room like glitter snow. A manager named Vince, a heavy-set man with kind eyes and a receding hairline, sat me down with a bottle of water and started pulling up footage. The female security guard, whose name was Jackie, stayed by my side the entire time. Within minutes, they found him. The man in the server uniform appeared on camera at 11:38, walking through a service entrance near the loading dock. He was not on the employee roster. He had acquired a staff wristband from somewhere, probably stolen it off a real server, and had walked through the back hallways like he belonged there. On another monitor, they tracked him moving through the crowd, champagne flute in hand, stopping at my table for less than 30 seconds before vanishing again. Vince rewound and zoomed in, and I saw it clearly. The moment before he approached me, he pulled a small vial from his pocket and tipped something into the glass. But what made me feel truly sick was the footage from the back exit. Starting around 11:50, the same man appeared on the camera covering the rear door, the one that led to the alley behind the club. He checked the handle. He looked at his phone. He paced a few steps away, then came back. Every 2 or 3 minutes he repeated this pattern, his eyes fixed on the door like a predator waiting at a watering hole. The timestamp in the corner ticked past midnight, past 12:15, past 12:30. He only left when a delivery truck pulled into the alley at 12:42, headlights flooding the area and forcing him to retreat into the shadows and eventually out of frame. The two men who had tried to escort me out of the club never appeared on that camera. Jackie told me they had probably been stationed inside to guide targets toward the exit, while the man outside handled whatever came next. Targets. She used that word like it was routine, like they had a whole system figured out. The police arrived around 1 in the morning. 2 detectives, a man and a woman, took my statement, while a paramedic checked my vitals and drew blood to confirm what everyone already knew. They found traces of gamma-hydroxybutyrate in my system, the same substance that shows up in dozens of cases like mine every year. Heather finally appeared around 1:30. Mascara streaked down her face, sobbing and apologizing for disappearing. I did not have the energy to be angry with her. The detectives told me they would pull the footage, run facial recognition, do everything they could. But their tone carried a weight I recognized, the kind of professional pessimism that comes from working too many cases that go nowhere. The men knew how to avoid being identified. They wore no distinctive clothing, had no visible tattoos, and the camera angles never captured a clear shot of the tall one's face. The wristband had been reported stolen by a server who noticed it missing around 10:45, but assumed he had simply misplaced it in the chaos of the night. These men had done this before. They would probably do it again. I spent New Year's Day in bed, curtains drawn, jumping at every sound from the hallway outside my apartment. Heather stayed with me for 3 days straight, sleeping on my couch and checking the locks every few hours. The bruises on my arm turned purple, then yellow, then faded into nothing. The police called twice over the following weeks, once to confirm the toxicology results, and once to tell me they had not been able to identify any of the 3 men. The case went cold, filed away with hundreds of others just like it. I still think about that night, about the single knock on the bathroom stall door and the breathing on the other side. I think about the man waiting by the back exit, checking his phone, patient as a spider in a web. Sometimes I wonder if he found someone else that night after I escaped, someone who did not make it to the bathroom in time. I do not go to clubs anymore. I do not accept drinks I did not watch being poured. And every December 31st, while the rest of the world celebrates, I stay home with the doors locked and the lights on, grateful to be alive and terrified of the people who tried to make sure I would not be. New Year's Eve has always been my excuse to stay indoors. While everyone else floods the streets and packs into bars, I prefer the quiet of my own apartment. A modest 2-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor of a building in a working-class neighborhood just outside of Houston. My sister Vicky keeps telling me I need to get out more, that turning 34 means nothing if I spend every holiday like a hermit. But after 10 years working as an HVAC technician, crawling through attics and dealing with people's broken units all day, the last thing I want is to squeeze into some overcrowded venue with strangers screaming in my ear. That Wednesday night, December 31st, 2023, felt like any other quiet celebration to me. I had invited my buddy Jerome and his wife Patty over for some food, a few beers, and whatever countdown show was playing on TV. Nothing fancy, nothing wild. Just 3 people in their 30s acting their age for once. My apartment sat on Ridgecrest Drive, a street that got louder every year as the neighborhood changed, but I figured the noise would die down by 1 or 2 in the morning like it always did. Jerome and Patty left around 12:30, right after we watched the ball drop and clinked our bottles together. Patty had to work an early shift at the hospital the next morning, so they didn't stick around long. I remember standing at my door, waving them off as they walked down the outdoor corridor toward the stairwell, their footsteps echoing against the concrete. The air outside was thick with the smell of gunpowder and barbecue smoke, and I could hear fireworks popping somewhere in the distance, or at least what I assumed were fireworks. That distinction would matter a lot more in about 20 minutes. I closed the door, locked the deadbolt, and started gathering up the paper plates and empty bottles from my coffee table. My TV was still on, some post-midnight coverage showing celebrations in Times Square, and I had this peaceful feeling in my chest like the night had gone exactly as planned. I carried the trash into the kitchen, tossed it in the bin under the sink, and grabbed a wet rag to wipe down the counter. Everything was calm, everything was normal, and I had no idea that my ceiling was about to explode. I was wiping down the kitchen counter when I heard the first crack. It wasn't like a firework. Fireworks have that whistling buildup, that theatrical pause before the boom. This was sharp, sudden, like someone snapping a thick branch right above my head. I looked up at the ceiling just in time to see a chunk of drywall the size of my fist come loose and tumble down onto my living room carpet. Dust puffed up from the impact, little white particles floating in the glow of my floor lamp. For a second, I just stood there with the wet rag in my hand, trying to process what I was seeing. My first thought was that something had fallen on the roof, maybe a piece of debris from a firework or some drunk idiot throwing something off a balcony. But then I noticed the hole, a small, dark puncture in the ceiling surrounded by cracked plaster, perfectly round, like someone had driven a nail through from the apartment above. Except there was no apartment above me. I lived on the top floor, and above my ceiling was nothing but roofing material and open Texas sky. I walked over slowly, my brain still not catching up to what my eyes were telling me. The debris on the carpet wasn't just drywall. There was something else mixed in, something small and metallic glinting under the lamplight. I crouched down and saw it clearly. A bullet, deformed and flattened on one side, sitting right there on my beige carpet like it belonged there. I picked it up without thinking, and the heat surprised me so much that I almost dropped it. The metal was warm. Not burning hot, but definitely warm. The kind of temperature you feel when you grab a coffee mug that's been sitting out for 10 minutes. My mind raced through possibilities. A gun accident in a neighboring building, some kind of malfunction, maybe a hunter somewhere outside the city limits. None of it made sense. I was standing in my own living room holding a bullet that had just fallen from my ceiling. And outside, I could still hear what sounded like 100 firecrackers going off in every direction. That's when the second shot came through. This one was closer. Way closer. The crack was louder, more violent, and a spray of white dust erupted from the ceiling maybe 6 feet to my left, right above the edge of my couch. I watched in horror as a second chunk of drywall broke loose and crashed onto the cushions, followed by another bullet that bounced off the armrest and rolled onto the floor. My body finally caught up to my brain, and I dropped to my knees behind the kitchen island, pressing my back against the cabinets. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, in my temples, in my fingertips. Someone was shooting at my apartment. That was the only thought I could form. Someone was shooting at my apartment, and I had no idea who or why. I pressed myself lower, trying to make myself as small as possible, my cheek against the cold tile floor. The popcorn ceiling above me suddenly looked like a minefield, every inch of it a potential entry point for the next round. I could hear more pops outside, more cracks, more explosions that I now knew weren't fireworks at all. I fumbled for my phone in my pocket, my fingers clumsy and uncooperative. The screen lit up and I dialed 911, pressing the phone hard against my ear while keeping my body flat behind the island. It rang 4 times before someone picked up, and the voice on the other end sounded exhausted, overwhelmed like they'd already answered 1,000 calls that night. I tried to explain what was happening. Bullets coming through my ceiling, 2 shots already, I'm hiding in my kitchen. But the words came out jumbled and frantic. The dispatcher asked for my address and I gave it to her, spelling out Ridgecrest Drive twice because she couldn't hear me over the noise in the background on her end. Then she said something that made my entire body go cold. She told me that they were receiving dozens of calls about gunfire across the city, that officers were stretched thin responding to shootings and accidents, and that it might be 30 to 40 minutes before anyone could get to my location. 30 to 40 minutes. I was lying on my kitchen floor with bullets punching through my roof, and the best they could offer was maybe an hour. The dispatcher told me to stay low and stay away from windows, like I needed instructions on how to not get shot. She said she'd keep my call logged as a priority, but I could hear the doubt in her voice, the resignation of someone who knew the system was failing in real time. I thanked her anyway and hung up, then immediately called Jerome. He picked up on the second ring, his voice groggy like he'd already fallen asleep in the car ride home. I told him what was happening, speaking fast and low, and I heard Patty gasp in the background when she understood. Jerome wanted to come back, wanted to drive over right then. But I told him no. The streets were chaos. People were firing guns into the air everywhere. And the last thing I needed was my best friend catching a stray bullet on his way to save me. He made me promise to keep texting him every few minutes, to let him know I was still okay. I promised, even though I had no idea if I would be okay, if any of us would be okay, if this nightmare would ever end. I army crawled from the kitchen toward the hallway, keeping my body as flat as possible against the tile. My bathroom was at the end of the hall, a small, windowless room with a cast-iron bathtub that my landlord had never bothered to replace. In that moment, that old ugly tub seemed like the safest place in the world, surrounded by walls on all sides, no ceiling exposure to the roof, just solid porcelain and iron between me and whatever was falling from the sky. I pulled myself along the floor, my elbows burning against the rough surface, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. Another crack echoed somewhere outside, followed by a whoop of celebration and more gunfire. I realized then what was happening, why the bullets were coming down at random angles, why the police couldn't stop it. It wasn't a shooting in the traditional sense. It was celebratory gunfire. People all over the neighborhood, maybe all over the city, firing their pistols straight up into the air to ring in the new year. And what goes up, as they say, must come down. Every bullet that left those barrels was arcing through the night sky and falling back to earth with enough force to punch through roofing material, through drywall, through flesh and bone if you were unlucky enough to be in its path. I made it to the bathroom and climbed into the tub, pulling myself over the cold porcelain edge and curling up at the bottom like a child hiding from a thunderstorm. The cast iron pressed against my spine, hard and unforgiving, but I didn't care. I lay there in the dark, staring up at the bathroom ceiling, listening to the chaos outside. Every pop made me flinch. Every crack sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I kept my phone clutched against my chest, the screen lighting up every few minutes with texts from Jerome asking if I was still alive. I typed back one-word responses. Yes, okay, still here. Because I couldn't manage anything more. Time moved strangely in that bathtub. Minutes felt like hours, and hours felt like days. I could hear music playing from somewhere down the street, bass thumping through the walls, people laughing and shouting like the world wasn't raining bullets. At one point, I heard a woman scream, a sharp piercing sound that cut through everything else, and I pressed my palms over my ears and squeezed my eyes shut and prayed it wasn't what I thought it was. The third bullet came through around 1:15 in the morning. I heard it hit somewhere in the apartment, a distant thud followed by the familiar sound of debris falling. I didn't move from the bathtub. I couldn't move. My legs had gone numb from the awkward position, and my back was screaming from being pressed against the hard surface for so long, but none of that mattered. I just lay there, counting the seconds between each burst of gunfire outside, trying to calculate how many more rounds might be headed my way. I thought about my mom, who lived alone in a single-story house on the other side of town, and wondered if she was safe. I thought about Jerome and Patty, probably home by now, probably lying in their bed unable to sleep. I thought about all the New Year's Eves I had spent complaining about the noise, rolling my eyes at the reckless idiots shooting their guns into the air, never once imagining that I would end up cowering in my bathtub while their bullets punched holes through my home. The gunfire outside seemed to come in waves, intense barrages followed by brief moments of quiet, then building up again like a storm that refused to pass. Somewhere around 2:30, the shooting started to slow down. The gaps between bursts grew longer, the pops more scattered, the whoops and cheers less frequent. I stayed in the tub anyway, not trusting the silence, not trusting anything. My phone battery had dropped to 12%, and I watched it tick down with growing anxiety, knowing that if something else happened, I might not be able to call for help. At 3 in the morning, I finally heard sirens, not coming to my building, but somewhere nearby, maybe a block or two over. I wondered if someone had been hit, if that woman's scream I heard earlier had been more than just fear. I wondered how many people across the city were lying in bathtubs just like me, or hiding under beds, or pressing themselves flat against floors while the sky rained metal. The thought made me feel less alone and more terrified at the same time. By 3:30, the gunfire had mostly stopped, replaced by the distant wail of ambulances and the occasional bark of a dog. I waited another 30 minutes before I trusted myself to move, my muscles stiff and aching as I pulled myself up and over the edge of the tub. I walked through my apartment like a survivor, surveying the wreckage after a natural disaster. The living room was covered in a thin layer of white dust from the ceiling damage. I found 3 holes total, one above the carpet where the first bullet came through, one above the couch from the second, and a third near my bedroom door that I hadn't even heard happen. The bullets themselves were scattered across the floor, small deformed pieces of metal that had traveled through the night sky before crashing into my life. I picked them up one by one and dropped them into a glass jar on my kitchen counter, my hands still trembling from the adrenaline that hadn't fully left my system. The police finally showed up around 4:15, 2 exhausted officers who took photos of the damage and filled out a report that I knew would go nowhere. They told me that dozens of people had called in similar complaints, that at least 3 people in the greater Houston area had been hit by stray bullets that night, including a teenager who was in critical condition at Memorial Hermann. They gave me a case number and a pamphlet about victim services and wished me a happy new year on their way out the door. I moved out of that apartment 6 weeks later, broke my lease, paid the penalty, and found a ground floor unit in a quieter part of town where the neighbors are mostly retirees and young families. My landlord tried to charge me for the ceiling repairs, but I threatened to go to the local news with photos of the bullet holes, and he backed off pretty quick. Jerome helped me pack up my stuff, and when we carried the last box down to the moving truck, I looked up at my old living room window and felt nothing but relief. I still have those 3 bullets in that glass jar, sitting on a shelf in my new place like some kind of morbid souvenir. People ask me about them sometimes, and I tell them the story, and they always react the same way. Disbelief first, then horror. Then that uncomfortable silence that comes when someone realizes how close you came to not being here anymore. My sister Vicky says I should throw them away, that keeping them is unhealthy, but I disagree. I keep them because I need to remember how random it all was, how easily one of those rounds could have come through while I was standing up instead of crouching down. New Year's Eve came around again this past December, and I spent it at my mom's house on the other side of town, far from the neighborhoods where people still think firing guns into the air is a celebration. We watched the countdown on her old television, drank sparkling cider because she doesn't keep alcohol in the house, and when midnight hit, I flinched at every distant pop I heard outside. She noticed, of course. Moms always notice. And she put her hand on my arm and told me I was safe. I wanted to believe her, I really did. But the truth is, I don't think I'll ever hear fireworks the same way again. Every crack, every boom, every whistle sends my mind back to that bathtub, to those hours spent curled up against cold porcelain while the world fell apart above me. I survived that night by pure luck, nothing more. The bullets that came through my ceiling could have hit me just as easily as they hit the drywall. And somewhere out there, the people who fired those shots probably don't even know what they did. They probably woke up the next morning with hangovers and empty magazines, and no idea that their celebration almost ended my life. That's the part that haunts me the most. Not the fear, not the helplessness, but the randomness of it all. The complete and total randomness. The last night of that year still sits in my memory with this strange mix of excitement and static, like a song that cuts out right before the best part. I'd headed downtown with my friend Marissa because neither of us wanted to spend New Year's Eve alone in our apartments again. The city had turned the main square into this giant glowing stage, packed with food trucks, metallic confetti drifting over everyone's heads, and a countdown timer projected against a building that reflected the lights like a cracked mirror. I remember feeling almost weightless from the noise and the closeness of people leaning shoulder to shoulder, just trying to see the fireworks better. At that moment, everything felt safe, crowded, but safe. Marissa kept tugging at my sleeve, pointing at strangers' ridiculous hats or couples rehearsing kisses too early. We laugh the way you laugh when you're trying to convince yourself the year will be different just because the clock says so. The countdown hit 0, and the square erupted with a roar so loud it felt like the air thickened around us. People jumped, hugged, screamed, and that huge surge of bodies moved in every direction at once. Marissa and I lifted our phones to film, trying not to poke anyone in the eye, while fireworks exploded behind the skyscrapers in colors so bright they washed out the whole sky. It took maybe 2 minutes for the happy chaos to shift into something far more frantic. The crowd started pushing toward the metro entrance we needed to reach, and our steps got pulled into that tide whether we wanted them to or not. Marissa was right in front of me, literally an arm's length, her hair full of glitter, her silver scarf trailing like a tail behind her. I kept my eyes on that scarf because it became the only anchor I had in the movement. By the time we reached the sidewalk near the metro steps, that anchor slipped. A group surged between us, drunk and loud, and bodies shuttled us apart in this jittery sideways motion I couldn't control. I tried calling her name, but the fireworks drowned everything out. I could still see the top of her head, but the stream of people pushed her forward faster than me, almost funneling her toward the entrance. It didn't feel threatening, just messy, so I figured she was getting carried ahead and would wait for me downstairs. My boot slid slightly on crushed confetti, and someone bumped my shoulder hard enough to tilt my balance. When I regained it, her silver scarf was nowhere in sight. Still, that didn't alarm me yet. It was New Year's Eve. People were basically a living river at that point. Inside the station, the atmosphere felt tighter, like the walls were amplifying every leftover shout and every echo from the street above. Trains were pulling in and out non-stop, trying to move crowds before things turned into another headline about injuries near the square. I stepped into the first car that opened, scanning faces quickly, expecting to see Marissa waving me over with that mocking, "took you long enough" expression she always used. Instead, my phone buzzed right as the doors were about to close. The message preview lit up my screen in this stark white box that didn't match the celebration at all. It was from Marissa, sent seconds earlier, and it read, "Someone's pulling me. Help." The doors slid shut in front of me before I could step out. The train lurched forward, but my mind barely registered the movement. That message didn't match the tone of anything we'd lived in the past hour, and the wording hit me with this sharp clarity that cut through the leftover excitement. I squeezed past a couple leaning against the pole and hit the emergency intercom before I could second-guess myself. My voice came out too loud, telling the operator I needed to get off at the next stop immediately. People stared, but no one asked what was happening. Everyone looked exhausted from the crowd. When the train stopped, I pushed through the doors the second they opened and sprinted up the escalator 2 steps at a time, my heart slamming against my ribs in a messy rhythm that had nothing to do with panic attacks and everything to do with the fact that Marissa wasn't answering a single call. Outside, the fireworks were still echoing across the downtown buildings, masking sirens and shouts from somewhere close. When I reached the street level, the police presence had doubled. Officers were guiding injured people toward makeshift aid stations, and I overheard someone mention crush injuries near the center of the square. That only added to the mess in my head, but I forced myself to retrace our route as precisely as I could. Every block looked slightly distorted, as if the combination of smoke, confetti, and leftover bursts of light had thrown a filter over the city. I followed the path we'd carved through the crowd earlier, checking the ground for anything familiar. A glove, a hat, a metallic noisemaker. None of it mattered. None of it was hers. My brain kept clinging to the last clear image I had of her. That silver scarf dragging lightly against the pavement as she pushed toward the metro steps. It took me several minutes to reach the spot where we'd been separated, and that's when I noticed a shape on the ground that hadn't been there before. The scarf lay half crumpled near the side of a maintenance doorway built into the station wall. The metal door was supposed to stay locked. Every local knew that. Yet it sat slightly ajar as if someone had nudged it with their foot while passing through. The scarf looked like it had been dropped mid-movement, not placed gently. I crouched and picked it up, and there was this faint smell of the cologne she'd been wearing earlier, mixed with something damp and metallic that didn't fit the night at all. I called her again, straight to voicemail. Something in my chest tightened, and I backed away just enough to catch a breath before leaning toward the doorway. Inside the narrow opening, a sliver of yellow light flickered, the kind produced by old bulbs that hum louder than they shine. The passage led downward, not deep, but enough that the sounds of the street faded into a muffled roar. A sign on the wall read, "Authorized personnel only," and the paint was peeling like bark off a dying tree. I hesitated because stepping in felt like breaking a boundary the city had drawn on purpose. But the scarf was still in my hand, and the message on my phone hadn't magically changed. I slipped through the doorway, keeping one hand on the wall because the floor slanted unevenly. The deeper I went, the more the tunnel carried this sharp smell of dust and wet concrete, and something else, something that reminded me of a basement after a flood. The tunnel curved left, then right, like it had been added in pieces over the years without any real planning. As I walked, the noise from above dissolved completely, replaced by the echo of my own footsteps bouncing off the walls in uneven patterns. That echo wasn't consistent, though. Every few seconds there was a second sound trailing mine, not synchronized, not repeated in the same rhythm. It felt like someone ahead of me was adjusting their pace on purpose. I kept calling Marissa's name, but the tunnel swallowed my voice, smothering the edges of it. The air grew heavier as I moved deeper, and the yellow bulbs blinked more frequently, making the whole place pulse like a heartbeat I wasn't part of. Eventually, the narrow passage opened into a larger service room filled with old equipment and cables, coiled across the floor like abandoned ropes. In the center of the room, a utility cart sat turned on its side, and behind it was a small alcove, no wider than a closet. I saw movement, tiny, hesitant, like someone pulling their hand away from the light. When I stepped closer, something shifted inside the alcove and a person rushed out, stumbling into me with so much force that we both slid across the dusty floor. It was Marissa. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, her voice scratchy from screaming in a place where no one could hear her. She kept saying someone had grabbed her wrist in the crowd and steered her toward the doorway, guiding her with this unsettling confidence, like they'd done it before. Before I could make sense of any of it, a shadow moved in the far corner of the room, a figure stepping back into darkness the moment our eyes met. The outline was tall, shoulders stiff, posture deliberate. Whoever it was didn't run. They simply retreated into a side passage with the slow certainty of someone who knew the layout far better than we did. I grabbed Marissa's arm, and we bolted in the opposite direction, retracing our steps through the tunnel as fast as our legs allowed. When we reached the doorway, 2 transit officers were already there, alerted by a station tech who'd seen the door open on his monitors. They pulled us out, locked the entrance, and called for backup, while Marissa tried explaining what had happened in broken, trembling sentences. Hours later, after statements, after medical checks, after far too many questions, one of the officers told us something that has stayed with me ever since. Security footage from the metro entrances showed multiple individuals being subtly redirected toward that same locked doorway throughout the night. The person doing it blended perfectly into the crowd each time, never touching anyone long enough to draw attention. They waited for moments when fireworks exploded, when the crowd surged, when no one was looking at anything except the sky. The police never found the person in the tunnel. They searched every inch before sealing it permanently, welding the door shut so no one could enter again. Marissa and I moved out of the city a few months later, and to this day, we don't talk about that night unless someone asks why we never attend public countdowns anymore. I still have her scarf folded in a drawer, and even now I check every doorway near a station before I walk past it. The drive home after the New Year fireworks usually felt like a small ritual for us. Windows cracked open to let out the smell of sparklers, heater buzzing, and my daughter half asleep in the back seat with one of her boots off. That night, though, the road cutting past the old industrial lots seemed darker than usual, like the streetlights were taking turns failing. I remember leaning forward in my seat, trying to make sense of the shapes outside while my brother, Mark, joked about how the town somehow looked older every year. We weren't in a hurry, just easing our way back after visiting relatives, still carrying that warm, tired feeling you get when the night went longer than planned. Nothing about that moment hinted that things were about to take such a sharp turn. The quiet in the car was almost comforting until Mark muttered something and tapped the brakes. At first, I thought he had slowed down because of debris on the shoulder, maybe some leftover fireworks or a bag that fell from someone's truck. But as the headlights stretched farther across the pavement, a shape stood out, too still, too human. The figure lay close to the gravel line, one arm bent under the body, and the other stretched out like they'd been trying to reach the grass. My chest tightened as I leaned closer, half afraid of seeing a face. The person's jacket had this strange, reflective strip that caught the light, not the kind used on work coats, more like one someone had sewn on themselves. Mark didn't say a word for a solid 5 seconds, just gripping the wheel with this tense calm that only appeared when he was trying not to scare the rest of us. When he pulled onto the shoulder, the car rolled to a stop with a slow crunch of gravel, and I could feel that eerie stillness sink in, the kind that makes every small sound seem louder. The air outside looked thick, almost muffled, and the only movement came from the blinking hazard lights reflecting off bits of broken pavement. Mark told me to stay in the car while he called emergency services, but I stepped out anyway, keeping a few feet behind him. The person on the ground didn't move at all, not even a twitch. There was this odd detail I can't shake. One of their shoes was several feet away, resting upright as if someone had set it down deliberately. Mark kept his voice steady while talking to dispatch, but the way he kept glancing around made it clear he sensed something wrong lurking beneath the surface of what we were seeing. By the time the first patrol car arrived, the officer barely had to look twice before asking us to step back. He walked along the shoulder with a flashlight angled low, sweeping slow, like he expected the ground to tell him a story. It didn't take long for him to find the tire marks, deep, curved impressions cutting across the gravel in a pattern that didn't match a simple accident. Another officer showed up, then a third, and soon they were moving with that clipped urgency people get when they realize they're not dealing with a random tragedy. One of them asked if we'd heard anything earlier, an engine revving, a shout, anything. But the night had been quiet besides the last echo of fireworks. When they told us it looked deliberate, the weight of it settled in so suddenly that even Mark stopped trying to keep his composure for my sake. The neighborhood surrounding that stretch of road slowly came alive as word spread that police were investigating something serious. People stepped out onto porches still wearing party hats, jackets thrown over pajamas, champagne flutes in hand. I remember a woman with a bright red scarf wrapped twice around her neck pointing down the street and telling an officer she'd heard a truck tearing through just after midnight. She described the engine as strained, like someone pushing it harder than it could handle. Another neighbor, an older man leaning heavily on a cane, mentioned seeing headlights swerving near the stop sign moments before disappearing into the dark. The officers marked every detail down, but the way they exchanged glances made it clear these accounts were aligning in a way they didn't like. While they continued gathering statements, one of the detectives, tall guy, narrow face, hair pulled back so tight it almost looked lacquered, approached us. He had this habit of pausing 2 seconds before speaking, as though mentally filtering every sentence. He asked again about the moment we first saw the figure, about the shoe lying away from the body, about how long we'd been parked. Mark answered most of it, but the detective kept watching me as if he wanted a second version of the night to compare against the first. I told him everything I remembered. The sudden stillness, the way the jacket reflected oddly, the absence of skid marks where a driver might have tried to brake. He nodded slowly at each detail, his expression tightening only when dispatch radioed something that made him stiffen and walk off without explanation. A few minutes later, something shifted among the officers, an almost electric ripple of urgency. Additional patrol cars pulled up, and the detective with the lacquered hair returned, now moving faster and speaking with clipped precision. He explained that a missing person alert had just come in from a town a little over an hour away. The description matched the person lying by the shoulder. According to the alert, the individual had been involved in a bar fight earlier that night, one that escalated more violently than anyone there expected. Someone had stormed out afterward, threatening to finish things, and witnesses mentioned a beat-up pickup truck with a dented passenger door speeding away from the parking lot. Hearing that made the scene in front of us tilt into something far heavier than a tragic coincidence. As they processed the information, the truck sightings from the neighbors suddenly snapped into focus for the investigators. The older man with the cane clarified that the truck he'd seen seemed lifted higher than usual, with mismatched headlights, one bright white, one dim and yellowish. The woman with the red scarf added that she noticed a long scrape along the passenger side as it raced past, illuminated briefly by leftover fireworks, smoke hanging low in the air. The detectives exchanged looks with the kind of realization that carries both clarity and dread. Everything was pointing towards someone who knew exactly what they were doing, someone who had chased this person down and used the dark, empty stretch of road as their stage. Standing there, watching the officers pace along the shoulder, I kept replaying the moment we first spotted the figure on the ground. The noise from distant parties had faded by then, leaving the scene oddly quiet, except for the steady hum of police radios. A gust of wind carried the faint popping of leftover fireworks from somewhere deeper in the neighborhood, but it only made the silence feel sharper. Mark leaned against the car, rubbing his jaw, staring at the tire impressions like he expected them to rearrange themselves and reveal something new. Even though we didn't know the victim personally, the weight of what had happened hung over us with this heavy, intrusive presence, as if the road itself had absorbed part of the violence. As the paramedics prepared to transport the victim, the lead detective pulled Mark and me aside. He told us they'd found fragments of blue paint embedded in the gravel, consistent with the description of the pickup from the bar fight. He also mentioned that fresh footprints had been discovered near the grass, scattered and uneven, suggesting the victim had tried to run before collapsing. Something about the way he said it made my chest tighten again. Not from fear, but from the realization that the person had likely seen the truck bearing down on them. The detective asked if we were willing to give statements at the station later that week, and we agreed immediately. It didn't feel like a choice, it felt like something we owed to the person who never made it past that patch of road. We eventually drove home in near silence, each of us locked in our thoughts. The heater clicked occasionally, filling the car with that dry warmth that usually felt comforting, but that night it just felt wrong, mismatched with the mood. When we passed through the last intersection before our street, I caught myself scanning every approaching set of headlights, searching for mismatched beams or a lifted frame. It was an involuntary habit that stuck with me for weeks afterward. Even my daughter, who had slept through most of the ordeal, sensed the tension the next morning when she asked why everyone seemed extra quiet. Mark and I just exchanged a look, neither of us wanting to explain something we barely understood ourselves. A few days later, the detectives called to let us know the pickup had been found abandoned behind an old storage facility 2 towns over. The driver had fled on foot, leaving behind a mess of fingerprints and a cracked phone still logged into social media. By the end of the week, they'd taken a suspect into custody, someone known for losing control when drunk, someone who'd reportedly left the bar swearing they weren't done yet. Hearing that brought a strange mix of relief and frustration. Relief because the person wouldn't hurt anyone else. Frustration because knowing the motive didn't make the scene on that roadside any easier to forget. We gave our statements, answered every question, and did what little we could. But even now, whenever New Year's comes around, I find myself thinking of that quiet stretch of pavement and hoping no one else ever ends their night the way that poor soul did. By the time that New Year's Eve rolled around, I'd been juggling too many things at once. My job at a small marketing firm, a shaky relationship I was trying to stabilize, and a general sense that I needed one night to just breathe. So when my friend Lucas dragged me to a house party across town, I figured a few hours away from everything wouldn't hurt. The place belonged to one of his co-workers, a guy I barely knew, and the house was packed with people leaning on countertops, laughing too loudly, clutching cheap champagne in plastic cups. I remember noticing the decor, random thrift store paintings mixed with those battery-powered candles that flicker like they're trying too hard. It felt like every room had a different playlist competing with the next. At some point, while I was standing near a doorway trying to cool off, a woman I'd never seen before approached me. Not casually, she stepped in close like she already knew me. She had sharp, restless eyes and this odd habit of tapping her thumb against her index finger like she was counting seconds. She asked my name, then immediately asked if I wanted to go somewhere quieter with her. I told her I wasn't interested and tried to be polite about it, but she didn't take it well. She leaned in closer, said something under her breath that I couldn't understand, and then walked away so abruptly it almost felt theatrical. I remember watching her disappear into the crowd and feeling an uneasy pressure in my chest, like I'd accidentally broken some unspoken rule. Nothing else weird happened at the party. I went home after midnight, fell asleep on the couch still wearing my jacket, and woke up the next morning to a phone that wouldn't stop vibrating. At first I assumed it was Lucas sending me blurry pictures from the night before. Instead, it was a string of messages from friends asking what the hell I had done. A couple of them weren't even subtle. One told me to explain myself fast. My stomach tightened as I unlocked the first link someone sent. It led to a brand new social media profile using a grainy selfie of me from years ago, slapped beside a long post claiming I'd assaulted a woman at the party. No details, no name attached, just enough vagueness to let people fill in the gaps themselves. Within an hour, the post had been shared into circles I didn't even know I was part of anymore. Old classmates, co-workers, neighbors. People who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly felt comfortable chiming in with half-baked judgment. My girlfriend didn't answer my calls. Even my boss left a voicemail saying we needed to talk immediately. What really rattled me was the confidence in the fake profile's tone, as if whoever wrote it had practiced mimicking my voice. They added small things only someone who'd observed me closely would know. References to my jacket, the specific drink I'd been holding, the room I'd been in. None of it proved anything, but it painted a picture vivid enough for people to believe whatever they wanted to believe. I kept trying to reach people who knew me well, hoping someone would slow down long enough to hear me out, but most conversations shut down before they even started. One longtime friend sent a single message saying, "Man, this looks really bad," and then vanished offline. Even Lucas, who'd been at the party with me the entire night, hesitated when I called. He told me he hadn't seen anything happen, but that a couple of people claimed the woman I'd spoken with had left the house crying. That detail didn't match anything I remembered, but it was just specific enough to feed the spreading rumor. After we hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall, trying to make sense of how fast the whole situation had taken on a life of its own. My first instinct was to track down the post's creator, so I dug into the fake profile. Whoever made it had gone to great lengths to hide their tracks. The account had only one friend, an empty-looking profile created on the same day. No personal photos, no background info, not even the usual list of random liked pages. Just post after post pushing the same accusation, worded slightly differently each time, almost like they were testing which version would get the most traction. I tried reporting it, but the platform's automated system brushed it off, claiming they found no violation. Seeing that message felt like watching a door lock on its own while I was still standing outside. That afternoon, things got worse. My girlfriend finally called, her voice tight and clipped, asking me to stay at my place for a while so she could think clearly. I could hear chatter in the background, her sister, maybe a friend, feeding her their own interpretations while she tried to talk to me. I kept replaying every second of the night in my head, searching for anything that could have been misunderstood, but nothing fit the story being told. The woman from the party had barely spoken to me beyond that strange interaction. The more I tried to explain this, the more it sounded like I was dodging blame, like I was constructing a narrative instead of just telling the truth. By early evening, someone had taken screenshots of the fake profile and reposted them in a community group connected to my workplace. Colleagues I'd never interacted with were now leaving comments wondering if the company would take appropriate action. When I tried logging into my work email to get ahead of it, I found my access temporarily suspended. That was the moment a kind of heavy electric tension settled in my chest, because it became obvious that whoever targeted me wasn't just stirring up trouble for fun. They were pushing everything toward a point where I'd be isolated, discredited, and unable to defend myself. And the scariest part was realizing that the only person at the party who'd acted strangely was the same woman, whose name I still didn't know. I decided to go back to the house where the party had taken place, hoping someone there might remember the woman, or at least give me her name. When I pulled up, the place was noticeably quieter than the night before. A couple of empty cups were still scattered in the yard, and faint music played from somewhere inside, like someone had forgotten to turn off a speaker. The host, a guy named Trevor, answered the door looking groggy and confused, wearing a hoodie with a faded logo and holding a half-eaten granola bar. When I asked if we could talk, he let me in but kept glancing at his phone as if expecting the conversation to go sideways. I explained everything as calmly as I could, watching his confusion shift into discomfort. When I mentioned the woman who had approached me, he paused as if searching his memory for something that wouldn't come. He said he didn't recognize the description at all. Sharp eyes, constant tapping, that weirdly rehearsed way she spoke. He insisted he'd never invited anyone like that, and would have remembered if she'd caused any trouble. The more he denied knowing her, the stranger the situation felt. He finally admitted that a few people had mentioned seeing someone crying near the bathroom, but nobody could agree on what she looked like. Some said she wore a dark jacket. Others insisted it was light-colored. One person swore she had short hair, while someone else was adamant she had long hair pulled into a braid. It was like people were describing 4 different women. As I left the house, I called Lucas again and asked if he could meet me somewhere quiet. He showed up at a small coffee shop near the river, looking uneasy but trying to be supportive. I walked him through everything I'd found so far, and he leaned forward with both elbows on the table, tracing the rim of his cup with one finger while he listened. When I mentioned the conflicting descriptions of the woman, he nodded slowly and said something that stuck with me. It's like she wanted attention, but not an actual identity. That phrasing hit harder than he probably intended. The idea that someone could deliberately move through a crowd leaving such scattered impressions, barely consistent, yet memorable enough to weaponize, made the whole situation feel less random and more deliberate. On my way home, I decided to check the fake profile again, half hoping it had been taken down. Instead, I found a new post pinned to the top, a long message claiming I'd threatened the woman after she tried to get help. They even added a timestamp suggesting the argument had happened around the same moment I was outside talking with Lucas. The post included a blurry photo of the back of my jacket taken from an angle I didn't recognize. I hadn't felt watched at the party, but clearly someone had been paying very close attention to me. And seeing that picture, slightly tilted, taken from a doorway, made me realize that whoever started this had been close enough to brush past me without me ever noticing. When I got home, I called my brother, who's usually the level-headed one in the family, hoping he'd give me some unbiased perspective. Instead, he sounded wary, like he was choosing every word with caution. He told me he believed me, but he also said the situation was bigger than either of us expected. Someone had messaged him anonymously with screenshots before I even reached out, urging him to take distance for everyone's sake. Hearing that made something tighten behind my ribs. Not fear exactly, but a sharp awareness that the person behind this wasn't just tossing accusations into the void. They were reaching into my life with surgical precision, touching people I trusted before I could. I ended the call feeling like the walls of my life had shifted a few inches inward. That night I barely slept. Instead, I sat on my couch with every light on, scrolling through the fake profile again and again, trying to find a crack in it. Around 3 in the morning, a comment appeared under one of the posts, an account I didn't recognize tagging another person and saying, "Isn't this what you warned us about?" Curious, I clicked on the commenter's profile. Buried in their old posts was a picture from the New Year's Eve party, taken in the kitchen. In the corner, near a stack of red cups, stood the same woman who had approached me. Same restless hands, same intense stare. The photo was time-stamped hours earlier than when she spoke to me, but her expression was identical, like she'd been maintaining the same mask all night. And beside her stood someone I did recognize, Trevor, the host, laughing at something off camera. The next morning I went back to Trevor's house unannounced. This time he looked more alert, almost expecting me. When I showed him the picture, the color drained from his face. He admitted he remembered the moment it was taken and said the woman had shown up with a coworker of his, a guy I'd met once years ago at a different event, someone I barely remembered, someone who, according to Trevor, had left the party early without saying goodbye. That thread unraveled fast. I looked up the coworker's old posts, and the pattern hit me in an instant. Comments he'd made about people getting away with things, vague rants about being overlooked, and several posts hinting at grudges against people who acted superior. It wasn't solid proof, but it was enough to piece together a disturbing possibility, that he'd orchestrated the entire thing out of resentment, using a stranger with enough social camouflage to stir chaos without being remembered clearly. I confronted him online, sending a long message laying out everything I'd connected. He never replied, but within an hour, the fake profile disappeared, and all the reposts from the secondary account vanished as well. My work access was restored the next day. My girlfriend came over that evening, and the tide of outrage slowly drifted away as people realized the posts were gone. Nobody apologized, and nobody admitted they'd been quick to believe a stranger over me. The whole situation just dissolved, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the accusations themselves. To this day, I don't know whether the woman was part of it or just someone he manipulated into playing a role. But every New Year's Eve since then, I catch myself scanning every room a little too carefully, wondering how close someone can stand without you noticing the damage they're about to cause.